My parents' flat was bustling with guests. One of my father's colleagues had come to visit for Sunday lunch, together with his new wife, who had recently arrived from Hyderabad. The colleague's son, the colleague's, the colleague's son, Sanjay, was also in tow, and had been allowed to invite my two best friends from primary school, in the hope that we could entertain him. I had a lurking suspicion that Sanjay considered my family beneath him on the social ladder beneath him on the social ladder because we were much poorer. On the other hand, I had heard that his father was anxious we would judge him by the lights of English standards for agreeing to arranged marriage after his last wife died. I wonder if Sanjay was still in mourning. The atmosphere lightened when my father's colleague clapped his hands together and told us about the technique of levitation he had learned from his uncle in India. The technique was simple. One of us sat on the chair while the rest of us gathered around and placed our hands above the heads of the person seated. Our hands should not touch, but be held just an inch or two apart, one above the other in a coordinated fashion, vaguely reminiscent of a seance.
Reminiscent.
Reminiscent of a seance. Seance.
Seance.
A seance. Vaguely reminiscent. Reminiscent of a seance. Vaguely reminiscent of a seance. And then, with great solemnity, with great solemnity, one index finger from each of us should be placed under the crook of the city people's knees and armpit. Slowly those fingers should then rise up, hoisting the city person aloft so that they floated effortlessly above the chair. Looking back now, my school friends and I experienced this demonstration with a mixture of awe and suspicion. Skepticism. On the one hand, we agreed that the body of the sitter did seem to be extraordinarily light. It was certainly not weightless, but on the other hand, it was not as heavy as any of us expected. None of us could have imagined that our fingers would be strong enough to lift an entire person. We tried to compare the effects, lifting someone without first performing the ritualistic preamble. One of my school friends insisted that the levitation effect only seemed to work if we follow the stipulated magical sequence correctly. Stipulated magical sequence correctly. I couldn't help wondering, though, if he was putting in the same effort to lift when we tried to perform the levitation without the magical preamble. If he was sitting in the same effort to lift. Even to my childlike mind, this did not seem to be a well-controlled experiment. I went along with it. I went along with it. I went along with it because what mattered socially was the shared excitement, the feeling that we had become channels for something powerful but inexplicable, 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 inexplicable,
inexplicable,
inexplicable, inexplicable, inexplicable, inexplicable, inexplicable. Ideas about levitating or floating bodies crop up in lots of different cultures. But why? A potentially compelling answer is that such ideas directly contradict our natural intuitions about the way the world works. In this case, our early developing assumption that a unsupported object falls earthwards, and that makes such ideas catchy. So, catchy counterintuitions and their social consequences. Okay. Humans' assumptions about gravity are detectable at a remarkably young age. Humans' assumptions about gravity are detectable at a remarkably young age. Remarkably. Developmental psychologists have shown that early in infancy, babies expect objects to fall to the ground if they are dropped and express surprise if an object floats upwards or hangs suspended in space without any supporters. These assumptions about how gravity should work seem to be built into babies' cognitive architecture. A psychologist would say these assumptions are underspecified by experience, meaning that babies haven't had enough exposure to the world to have predicted the effects of gravity based on observation alone. They seem to be naturally predisposed to anticipate that object will behave in that way and to find floaty things such as balloons filled with helium counterintuitive. Counterintuitive.
intuitive,
Helium, counterintuitive. But how, you may ask, could we possibly know that babies expect objects to do? Obviously, you can just ask them because they are too young to speak. But what developmental psychologists can do is establish which scenarios, presented in a carefully controlled lab settings, babies regard as more or less surprising. There are two ways in which surprise is typically measured in these situations. One is looking time. Infants stare longer at an event they weren't expecting, indicating curiosity. Another is sucking. Babies suck harder on an object in their mouths when they are surprised and therefore engrossed by an observed event. In numerous experiments, infants have been shown to exhibit expressions of surprise when objects behave in ways that were physically counterintuitive, such as floating upwards, popping up out of nowhere, or passing through each other like a ghost. This early developing fascination with counterintuitive events is no doubt why children's stories are full of them. Even young children are naturally absorbed by stories in which Superman can fly and Santa can pass through unvisibly small chimneys. But the lure of counterintuitive counterintuitive beliefs continues well into adulthood. This might explain not only why fairy tales spread so widely and are remembered and cherished across the generations, but also why ideas about supernatural agents disperse and endure in folklore. In adulthood, these beliefs tend to remain counterintuitive without actually being surprising. Where after we have become familiar with the idea of flying objects, from aeroplanes and gliders to birds and balloons, defiance of gravity had no longer unexpected, but is still eye-catchingly counterintuitive. Our tacit intuitions still inform us that the jet plane should really fall out of sky, which is why many of us still feel that flying is vaguely miraculous, and some will rather not risk it at all. The appeal of counterintuitive beliefs goes some way to explain the prevalence of supernatural prevalence
Prevalence.
of supernatural things, supernatural beings in religious texts and myth cycles. Many of the world's supernatural beings, such as ghosts, spirits, gods, and ancestors, are counterintuitive in such the same way as aeroplanes and hot air balloons. Balloon, 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 balloon,
Balloon.
balloons. In fact, if you want to create a simple ghost concept, just try to think of somebody who died in your house many years ago, but occasionally returns in the dead of light, popping up out of nowhere in the attic or floating in and out of the windows at will. The apparition you have now conjured up is just like any other human being, except that they can teleport and defy gravity and come back from the dead. But we will get to that later. We'll get to that later. It only requires one or a few counterintuitive properties to turn a perfectly normal conception of a person into a ghost, spirit, ancestor, or deity. It has been argued that most of the supernatural beings found in the world's many cultures can be predicted on the basis of a remarkably limited number of counterintuitive tricks to otherwise perfectly natural agents. According to Pascal Boyer, two kinds of tricks commonly underlie concepts of the supernatural, building on our evolved psychology. The first is simply take some intuitive property associated with a particular domain and specify that this property does not apply. This property does not apply. In the example I mentioned in the last paragraph, a simple ghost concept could entail violating expectations pertaining to all physical objects by describing scenarios in which a person can teleport or fly or pass through walls. Such as scenarios defy intuitive physics, in particular our naturally developing expectations that all objects must move through space in continuous paths, not pop out of nowhere, fall earthwards if unsupported, not float upwards or fly, and displace or break other objects colliding with them, not pass through solid objects, Boyer refers to such counterintuitive scenarios as breaches of intuitive knowledge. The second kind of counterintuitive trick will be one that takes a property from one domain and applies it one to another. For example, a weeping or bleeding statue transfers expectations from the domain of intuitive biology to the domain of artifacts. What's crucial, though, is that these supernatural phenomena are only mildly counterintuitive. We may believe in weeping statue. We tend not to believe a statue that only exists on Wednesdays. Boyer refers to the milder versions of minimally counterintuitive, a phrase that is now widely referred to in the literature as MCI. A veritable industry of research on the causes and consequences of MCI concepts now exists, much of it minimally counterintuitive, a veritable industry, veritable industry of research on the causes and consequences of NCI concept now exist. Much of it focused on the question of whether MCI concepts are more widespread cross-culturally because they are catchier than merely intuitive ideas. This catchiness will explain why such kinds of religious constructs are continually reinvented across remote cultural systems, from the primordial. Primordial beings of ancient myths to the superheroes of Marvel Comics, and from the accounts of miracles in New Testament to children's fairy tales. A central idea here is that although the supernatural beings we treat with solemnity and respect in places of worship may prompt very different reactions from those depicted in children's stories, they are rooted in the same basic psychology. Declaring that Santa knows who has been naughty or nice may prompt a smile, while denying the infallibility of the Pope could, in certain historical periods, get you burned at the stake. But the psychology needed to entertain both ideas is not so different. This would help to explain how both ideas initially got off the ground historically, irrespective of their contrasting social consequences. By the early 2000s, research on MCI concepts was rapidly expanding. More and more questions were being raised, not only about the cognitive catchiness of supernatural beliefs, but their social consequences. Do such beliefs help or hinder cooperation? Do they support or undermine the social order? And above all, are we naturally inclined to bow down to the gods and their earthly emissaries? And how might we tell? How can we tell? How might we tell? Emissary. The gods are in charge.